In the vast and tangled chronicles of Roman history, few names ignite as much intrigue and controversy as Marcus Aurelius Antoninus. Augustus, better known to us as Elagabalus, at only 14 years old, this Syrian teenager ascended to the throne of the greatest empire the world had ever seen, dragging with him a whirlwind of religious upheaval, personal scandal, and cultural collision that would leave the very core of Roman identity shaken. His reign, lasting just 4 years, wasn't merely about imperial excess or youthful recklessness. It was a clash, East versus West, Roman tradition versus foreign mysticism, rigid gender norms versus radical self-expression. Elagabalus would become a mirror, reflecting the cracks forming deep within Roman society, fractures that would widen into the full-blown crisis of the 3rd century. To understand who Elagabalus was and why his brief rule was so disruptive, we need to first understand his time. The early 3rd century was a period of mounting instability. The empire had reached its territorial peak under Trajan, but that vast stretch of land was beginning to show signs of strain. Military pressure from beyond the borders, economic turbulence, and rapid political turnover created an atmosphere of uncertainty. It was in this fragile world that Elagabalus emerged. Born into the Severan dynasty, a line of emperors with deep African and Syrian roots, his great-great-uncle, Septimius Severus, had risen through the military, and continued to rely heavily on army loyalty to hold power. Syria, the land of Elagabalus's birth, was no backwater. It was an ancient crossroads of cultures, Greek, Roman, Persian, and Semitic influences mixed here, giving rise to unique religious traditions that predated Rome by millennia. One of these was the cult of Elagabal, a solar deity centered around a sacred black stone believed to be a meteorite housed in a magnificent temple in Emesa. Elagabal wasn't just a sun god. He was tied to fertility, kingship, and the divine order. His priests were powerful, politically connected, and theatrically spiritual. At the heart of this web of power stood Elagabalus, a high priest of this ancient god, and his formidable grandmother, Julia Misa, along with her sister Julia, Domna, and nieces, Julia Soemias and Julia Mamaya. These Syrian women brought Eastern customs directly into the imperial bloodstream. When the unpopular Emperor Caracalla was assassinated in 217 AD and the Praetorian prefect Macrinus seized the throne, Julia Misa saw her moment, exiled by the new regime. She spread a powerful rumor that her grandson Elagabalus was the secret son of Caracalla, and therefore the rightful heir. Whether the claim was true or not didn't matter. It was politically potent. Elagabalus bore a striking resemblance to Caracalla, and his mystical charisma drew attention. In May of 218 AD, at a legionary camp in Emesa, Julia Misa bribed key officers and presented the boy in purple robes, claiming imperial legitimacy. The 3rd Gallic Legion hailed him as emperor, and the rebellion quickly swept across the east. Mac refs, caught flat-footed, attempted to crush the uprising. But in June, at the Battle of Antioch, his forces were annihilated. Macrinus fled, only to be captured and executed before reaching Rome. Elagabalus, at the age of 14, now ruled the Roman Empire. But behind the curtain, real power was held by his mother and grandmother, the women who had orchestrated his unlikely rise. As the young emperor journeyed slowly toward Rome, consolidating power along the way, something remarkable began to happen. Unlike many child emperors, Elagabalus didn't act as a passive puppet. He executed loyalists of Macrinus, replaced key officials with his own allies, and began to assert his personal authority. Soon, rumors began to filter into Rome. Stories of strange Eastern rituals, exotic dress, and disturbing religious proclamations stirred unease. When Elagabalus finally entered Rome in 219 AD, the city was stunned. He didn't arrive as a conquering general. He came dressed in silk, adorned with makeup and jewels, flanked by musicians and priests. And at the center of his procession, the sacred black stone of Elagabalus, transported all the way from Emesa, destined for a new temple on the Palatine Hill. This was more than cultural pageantry. It was a spiritual coup, Elagabalus declared. Elagabal, not just another Roman god, but the supreme deity, superior even to Jupiter. The traditional Roman pantheon was to be reorganized under this foreign sun god, with the emperor himself as high priest. Every day, the capital was treated to elaborate rituals, music, incense, frenzied dancing, and sacred processions. Romans watched in horror as their leader took to the temple in flowing robes and jeweled crowns, performing rites that felt alien, even blasphemous. But religion was only part of the scandal. Elagabalus's personal life further shocked Roman society. His brief marriage to Julia Paula, a noble Roman woman, ended abruptly. He then married Aquila Severa, a Vestal virgin, in open violation of one of Rome's most sacred laws. Vestals were sworn to chastity for 30 years. Their violation was seen as a national catastrophe, and then came the relationships that truly unsettled the empire. Elagabalus openly married male partners, including a charioteer named Heracles and an athlete named Zodicus. These were not discreet affairs, they were public ceremonies. The emperor presented himself as the bride, even asking to be called empress. Contemporary sources describe him wearing wigs, applying makeup, and donning women's clothing. Some even claim he sought surgery to alter his sex, offering rewards to anyone who could make him physically female. Whether these claims were exaggerated by hostile historians or not, they reflect the visceral reaction Elagabalus provoked. For conservative Romans, already uneasy with Eastern religious influence, his reign felt like an assault on everything Rome had ever stood for: tradition, order, masculinity, and the gods themselves. And yet, behind the sensationalism lies a deeper story, one of identity, power, and transformation. Elagabalus wasn't just a decadent youth lost in luxury. He was the embodiment of a world in flux. His rule exposed the deep fractures running through Roman society. The East was no longer a distant province, it had reached the throne. Gender, power, and religion were no longer fixed. They were fluid, shifting, contested, and for short, chaotic years. Rome had to reckon with that reality in the shadowed chambers of Rome's most powerful institutions. The personal and religious eccentricities of Emperor Elagabalus were not merely private matters, they were political earthquakes. The Roman Senate, ever wary of Eastern influence, now found itself dragged into alien rituals it considered degrading. Senators were compelled to attend ceremonies that clashed violently with traditional Roman decorum. What once passed for statecraft was now buried under an avalanche of foreign rites and mystic symbolism. And, as if that weren't enough, Elagabalus's indifference to Roman military traditions only deepened the crisis. Unlike his predecessors, who at least performed the illusion of martial valor, Elagabalus made no such effort. His only concern was the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard, which he secured through extravagant donations, wearing Eastern robes. He appeared at military ceremonies that alienated Rome's hardened officer class. He had little interest in frontier campaigns and frequently handed military commands to civilian priests, an act that undermined discipline and bred contempt among professional soldiers. His economic policies fared no better. The imperial treasury groaned under the weight of opulence. Lavish religious festivals, personal indulgences, and constant construction of new temples drained Rome's coffers. Gone were the old Roman virtues of frugality and moderation, replaced by an orgy of Syrian-style magnificence. The imperial court transformed into a spectacle of decadence that shocked even those familiar with the excesses of Nero or Caligula. Banquets were obscene in their scale, featuring rare delicacies and forms of entertainment many Romans considered perverse. The emperor often changed costumes several times during a single evening, flaunting his disregard for restraint. Within the palace walls, a new kind of warfare unfolded, one of intrigue, ambition, and influence. Syrian nobles, Roman senators, ambitious generals, and high priests all jockeyed for control over the impressionable young emperor. Even his own family walked a treacherous line between loyalty and self-preservation. Perhaps the most striking symbol of his transformation of the empire was the palace itself. It began to resemble a Syrian temple complex more than the heart of Roman power. Traditional Roman architecture gave way to Eastern aesthetics. A black meteorite, the sacred stone of Elagabal, was placed at the center of it all, enshrined and worshipped as a deity. Daily life in the palace revolved around relentless religious ceremonies. These rituals, often hours long, demanded the emperor's personal presence and left little room for matters of state. Business was delayed, decisions postponed, and officials exhausted. Many Roman elites found the rites not just tiring, but humiliating. To them, they were meaningless displays that clashed with every fiber of Roman religious sensibility. Some tried to rationalize their participation as a diplomatic necessity. Others began to conspire. Even foreign envoys weren't spared. Diplomats were subjected to the same ceremonial burdens, resulting in diplomatic blunders and embarrassment. Traditional allies grew uneasy. Enemies, meanwhile, saw opportunity in Rome's distracted and divided leadership. Among the common people, curiosity about the exotic quickly gave way to anger. Roman festivals were restructured to worship Elagabalus, igniting public outrage. Gladiatorial games, the very soul of Roman entertainment, were repurposed into bizarre spiritual performances. The crowds, expecting blood sport, were given holy pageants and incense. Boredom turned into resentment. Booing became commonplace when the emperor arrived clad in Eastern garb and flanked by his priests. The economic impact was no less devastating. Taxes soared to fund the emperor's spiritual vision. Merchants complained of disrupted trade due to constant religious holidays. Artisans were commandeered to produce ritual objects instead of goods for the market. Meanwhile, the frontiers crumbled. Barbarians breached borders as the legions were sidelined in favor of temple processions. Experienced generals began questioning the emperor's competence. In the provinces, the backlash intensified. Governors struggled to enforce unpopular religious edicts. In the Western territories, resistance turned into open revolt. Elagabalus responded not with reforms, but with repression punishing dissent, tightening control. But the real crisis came when he interfered with Roman family life. His attempt to redefine marriage and sexuality, elevating relationships that Roman society deemed unnatural, shattered what remained of his legitimacy. When he tried to legalize these changes, opposition solidified, and from within his own household, the seeds of his downfall were sown. Julia Missa, the emperor's grandmother and the architect of his rise, began to see the writing on the wall. The dynasty she fought to elevate was now at risk of total collapse. Behind the scenes, she reached out to military leaders and political insiders. They agreed. The empire needed a new ruler, one who could preserve their eastern influence without dragging Rome into ruin. The fate of an empire now depended not on a god, but on the quiet calculations of those who had once served him in the final months of Elagabalus's chaotic reign. A quiet but calculated move was taking shape within the imperial family. His cousin, Alexander Severus, was carefully positioned as an alternative, a younger, more controllable figure, untainted by the religious extremism that had come to define Elagabalus's rule. At the heart of this maneuver was Julia Missa, the emperor's powerful grandmother, who began laying the groundwork for a transition that would keep power within the dynasty while removing the source of growing outrage. The turning point came not from the Senate or the people, but from the Praetorian Guard, the elite military force that had once protected the emperor, but was now dangerously disillusioned. Despite being generously compensated, the Guard's patience was thinning. Elagabalus's disdain for military traditions, his promotion of unqualified favorites, and his lack of genuine interest in military affairs had alienated even those who had initially benefited from his rule. By early 222 AD, the conspiracy to remove him was well underway. It was no fringe revolt. Julia Missa was joined by senior senators, high-ranking Praetorian officers, and palace officials who had grown weary of the emperor's endless ceremonies and erratic behavior. These were not revolutionaries. They were loyalists who had lost faith and saw no other path forward. Elagabalus himself was spiraling. Historical records describe a ruler plagued by paranoia and bursts of uncontrolled rage. As dissent mounted, he responded not with reform or reconciliation, but with harsher punishments and increasingly fanatical religious rituals. Through the winter of 221 to 222, signs of collapse were everywhere. The emperor grew isolated from his traditional support base and appeared unable or unwilling to recognize how fragile his position had become. Even those closest to him began to quietly back away. The man who had once held Rome's future in his hands was now surrounded by silence. The end came on March 11th to 22 AD, during what was supposed to be a routine visit to the Praetorian camp. Elagabalus arrived with his cousin Alexander, unaware that this appearance was part of a carefully timed coup. When they reached the camp, it was already too late. The guards had pledged their loyalty not to their emperor, but to the boy, who stood beside him. What followed was swift and brutal. Elagabalus attempted to assert control, but his words carried no weight with men who had already chosen a new leader. He tried to flee, but every route had been sealed. In moments, the emperor, who had once commanded absolute obedience, was overtaken by those who had once sworn to protect him. Struck down by multiple assailants, his fate was sealed. He was just 18 years old. His mother, Julia Soaemias, who had accompanied him that day, was also killed. The Syrian branch of the imperial dynasty was eliminated in a matter of minutes. But, even in death, Elagabalus was denied dignity. His body, along with his mother's, was not given the honor traditionally reserved for Roman emperors. Instead, the corpses were dragged through the streets of Rome and thrown into the Tiber River, a punishment typically reserved for traitors and criminals. It was a final act of rejection, not just of the man, but of everything he represented. In the days that followed, Rome wasted no time in purging the memory of his reign. Temples dedicated to the Eastern god Elagabal were rededicated to Roman deities. Ceremonial practices that had dominated court life were swiftly abandoned. The sacred black stone he had brought from Syria, the centerpiece of his new religion, was returned to its homeland. In his place, Alexander Severus, guided by his mother, Julia Mamaea, and grandmother, Julia Misa, initiated a return to traditional Roman customs. The Senate passed a damnatio memoria, a formal erasure of Elagabalus' name and legacy from official records. But while his name was scratched from monuments and rewritten in stone, the memory of his reign proved harder to erase. Historians continued to write about him. Stories of his excesses, rituals, and behavior passed through generations, sometimes as cautionary tales, sometimes as scandalous curiosities. Over the centuries, interpretations of Elagabalus have shifted. Ancient sources like Cassius Dio and the authors of the Historia Augusta painted him as a depraved tyrant, the embodiment of everything Rome feared about Eastern influence. Medieval writers echoed these views, layering their own moral judgments on top. But modern scholars have begun to look deeper, questioning the biases of those early historians. Many now acknowledge that much of what we know about Elagabalus came from hostile sources, men predisposed to see Eastern customs as corrupt or unmanly. As a result, separating fact from fiction has proven difficult. One of the most debated aspects of his reign today is his gender identity. Some historians suggest that descriptions in ancient texts point to what we might now recognize as a transgender identity, making Elagabalus perhaps the first known transgender ruler in recorded history. Others argue that his behavior should be seen through the lens of Syrian religious traditions rather than modern definitions of gender. His religious reforms, while radical, were not entirely without precedent. In some ways, his vision of a single supreme solar deity foreshadowed reforms that would later be introduced under Constantine. But Elagabalus's youth, his timing, and his confrontational methods ensured his failure. Ultimately, his story offers more than just scandal. It stands as a warning, a reminder of the dangers that arise when rulers become disconnected from the people and traditions they govern. Elagabalus didn't just challenge Roman religion or social customs. He broke the unspoken contract between emperor and empire. And in Rome, there was no coming back from that. Elagabalus' reign stands as a vivid example of the fragile nature of absolute power. No matter how complete an emperor's authority may seem, it ultimately depends on the support, or at least the tolerance of crucial social groups. When that support vanishes, even the most powerful rulers become vulnerable. This was painfully clear in the case of Elagabalus, whose rise to power was deeply tied to the influence of Syrian women, particularly Julia Misa. She was instrumental, not only in elevating her grandson to the throne, but also in orchestrating his downfall. When his rule threatened the stability of the dynasty, Julia Misa's willingness to sacrifice family ties for political survival reveals how. In the brutal world of Roman imperial politics, loyalty was often secondary to strategic calculation. The carefully planned transition to Alexander Severus, following Elagabalus' removal, was designed to minimize chaos and maintain continuity. Despite the dramatic and often scandalous nature of his reign, Elagabalus' time as emperor sheds light on some of the practical challenges Rome faced during the turbulent 3rd century. His extravagant spending drained the imperial coffers, and his neglect of the empire's frontier defenses weakened Rome's ability to respond to external threats. The empire, while still vast and wealthy, was not immune to fiscal strain. Financial recklessness created problems that his successors would have to confront, underscoring the limits of imperial resources and the consequences of poor management. Beyond economics, the military played an increasingly decisive role in imperial politics, though Roman tradition maintained the appearance of constitutional governance. Real power lay in the hands of those who commanded the loyalty of the army. Elagabalus' disregard for military affairs and failure to cultivate support within the ranks proved fatal. His regime's downfall was as much a result of losing the army's favor as it was a political conspiracy. This growing military influence would shape the future of the Roman Empire for decades to come, as emperors would be defined more by their ability to control troops than by senatorial approval or dynastic inheritance. Culturally, Elagabalus' reign highlighted deep and enduring tensions within Roman society. His attempts to introduce Syrian religious practices to Rome brought into sharp relief the cultural clash between East and West. What Roman elites perceived as scandalous or alien rituals were, in fact, authentic expressions of religious tradition from Elagabalus' homeland. Recent archaeological discoveries at Emesa and other Syrian sites provide crucial context, revealing that the emperor's innovations were not bizarre eccentricities, but sincere attempts to integrate his native faith into Roman religious life. These findings challenge the narrative propagated by hostile ancient historians, who often exaggerated or distorted Elagabalus' behavior to promote political agendas and reinforce traditional Roman values. The psychological dimension of Elagabalus' story continues to intrigue scholars and audiences alike. Thrust into absolute power as a teenager, far from his native culture, Elagabalus faced immense pressures few could withstand. His inability or unwillingness to compromise with Roman expectations may have stemmed from a complex mix of personality traits and cultural displacement. The collision between his Syrian upbringing and the rigid norms of Roman imperial society created a volatile environment that made successful rule nearly impossible. This human aspect adds depth to a story, often reduced to sensationalism and scandal. Indeed, much of Elagabalus' legacy in popular culture is shaped by the most lurid and exaggerated ancient accounts. From Renaissance art to modern novels and films, he has been portrayed as the embodiment of decadence and sexual excess. These portrayals often reveal more about the cultural anxieties of later societies than about the historical emperor himself. The fascination with Elagabalus as a figure of excess reflects enduring themes about power, morality, and the outsider in Roman history and beyond. Despite his notorious reputation, Elagabalus' reign holds broader historical significance. It serves as a case study in the Roman Empire's capacity for change and the challenges that came with it. Although many of his religious and cultural reforms were rejected in his time, the empire would eventually experience transformative shifts nearly as radical. Elagabalus' failure was less about the impossibility of change and more about timing, approach, and political missteps. His story underscores how attempts at reform can be both visionary and doomed depending on context. Ultimately, Elagabalus remains one of the most fascinating and controversial figures in Roman history, whether viewed as a misunderstood innovator, a troubled youth, or a symbol of foreign corruption. His reign illuminates the complexities of power, identity, and cultural conflict in the ancient world. His violent death and the swift erasure of his legacy from official histories serve as a cautionary tale about the limits of imperial authority and the perils of ruling without broad-based support. More than 18 centuries later, the emperor, who sought to remake Rome in his own image, continues to provoke debate and reflection. His story challenges historians to look beyond sensationalism and explore the nuanced realities of empire, religion, and identity. In trying to impose his vision on Rome, Elagabalus ultimately ensured his own destruction, leaving behind a historical puzzle that still captivates scholars and audiences today.